Chapter 16. Triggered.
Come on in and make yourself at home, Shi-Wu. I've heard a lot of good things about you, so I am genuinely thrilled that we are going to get the opportunity to work together. Now please excuse my presumptiveness, but I've gone ahead and set you up with your own dedicated workstation.
Dr. Zakatika gestured towards a holographic, capable terminal in the far corner of the lab.
The good news is that the Queen herself has fully endorsed our collaboration, so it looks like exciting times lie ahead of us.
The Z-Bot eyed the elderly arachnid suspiciously.
The word endorsed would certainly be the most politically correct way of putting it, but ordered would be substantially more accurate.
The doctor just smiled benignly, as if the Z-Bot had just expressed its unqualified enthusiasm for the project.
Outstanding. And just between you and me, I've always liked a straight talker. But anyway, I'm sure you know better than anyone exactly what the Queen can be like when she gets her heart set on something. I think she is of the sincere opinion that we will make for an almost unbeatable team and solve this seemingly insoluble problem with our combined intellectual prowess. A 12 brains is better than one sort of thing, if you'll excuse the pun.
Ji-Woo held to stony silence until the doctor's mandibles started to twitch awkwardly.
That would seem to presume this so-called seemingly insoluble problem of yours is not in fact an actual insoluble problem, so perhaps you should start by giving me a little more background regarding this infamous paper.
You read my mind,
the doctor said enthusiastically.
But honestly, Shi-Wu, the concept itself is rather straightforward. It investigates the theoretical plausibility of low-level autonomous radioactive decay repair using wet-wired nanobio-augmentation at the molecular level.
Oh, is that all?
The Z-Bot replied drolly.
Yep, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Put simply, Ji-Wu, I need your intellectual muscle so that we can turn the admittedly highly speculative hypothesis contained in my original paper into verifiable theory. And then, hopefully from theory, into practical empirical results that we can actually make use of. But no pressure, eh?
The Z-Bot took a moment to consider the outrageously ambitious objective that the doctor had just outlined. Biotech at this level was immeasurably complex, so much so that it almost seemed irrational to take it seriously.
All right then, Doctor. I'll play along with your silly little game for the time being anyway. I will, however, reserve final judgment until I've been given full access to your related research, or lack of it, as the case may be.
I really couldn't ask for more,
the doctor declared exuberantly as he lightly slapped the outer shell of the Shi-Bot's carapace.
Well, whether you realize it or not, Shi-Wu, your remarkable creation has no doubt had a large part to play in the unexpected resurrection of this old pet project of mine. It has been a considerable amount of time indeed, since I was last involved in any sort of leading-edge research, and I must confess, it is almost enough to make me feel young again. Almost, anyway.
Is that so?
Shi-Wu replied doubtfully.
I suppose, then, that the work you have been doing with Zethusela for the last several years doesn't qualify as leading edge, as you so quaintly put it.
Zakatika's face remained implacably unreadable, and the Z-Bot had to admit to itself with a certain amount of professional regard that he was seemingly a much tougher nut to crack than Zethusela.
Well, I think you know how it works, Shi-Wu. Some things we do by choice, but others because we are compelled. I rather suspect that you know the difference all too well.
It suddenly occurred to the Shi-Bot that the good doctor could well have had almost as much to do with its creation as Zethusela himself. Perhaps the opportunity to spend some time with him was not such a bad thing after all, as who knows what secrets lay hidden behind that stoically unreadable expression of his.
All right, Dr. Zakatika, given you have such an apparent admiration for straight talk, I couldn't help but notice that you have significantly upgraded your network security since the last time I was here. Perhaps then you might consider simply granting me access to your research archive so that I can offer a more informed opinion as to how bad your chances really are. Or would you prefer me to just brute force my way in?
The doctor said nothing, but instead just briskly ran his digits over the display of his holographic terminal.
See? That wasn't so hard now, was it? All right, let's see what we've got here.
The Z-Bot proclaimed somewhat matter-of-factly.
Well, I can see that it made big news when it was first published, but it didn't exactly take very long before it started receiving a lot of professional criticism, most of it well-deserved, I might add. I would have to say that your paper looks somewhat akin to the theory of warp drive. In other words, solving the equations is one thing, but actually trying to engineer such a device is something else entirely. I suppose, then, that's where I come in, a kind of insert miracle here sort of thing.
The doctor seemed largely unfazed by Shiwu's scathing rhetoric.
Yes, but you can surely understand why the Queen was so motivated to at least look into the possibility. It certainly offers a tantalizing potential solution to an annoyingly fundamental limit regarding our current and ongoing extrasolar colonization efforts. After all, it's not as if you can just revive 1 billion-plus hibernating arachnids simply in order to give their bodies sufficient time to repair before putting them back under again. Of course, having the entire colony dead on arrival isn't exactly an appealing outcome either.
Ah yes, the Queen.
Shiwu said contemptuously.
Well, no doubt her revitalized enthusiasm for this project has absolutely nothing to do with her own self-serving agenda.
The Z-Bot paused briefly, almost as if giving itself some time to wallow in its own misery.
Well, I guess if nothing else, your paper at least appears to provide me with further opportunity to justify my continued existence, which I'm being constantly reminded is still far from a sure thing.
Dr. Sikatika just nodded agreeably at the Z-Bot, as if they were collaborators who shared a common secret.
Well, I'm certainly glad to see your understandable skepticism has not blinded you to the potential upside of our collaboration. Now, I know that trust is something earned, not given, but I'm also more than confident that in the fullness of time, you will come to recognize me as a true friend and confidant. Until then, though, we may as well get started on the work Citalia has very generously entrusted us with.
Shikatika had been genuinely perplexed almost to the point of concern as to Cthusela's unexpectedly premature call. Certainly he had not expected to be triggered so soon, but having Siwu in front of him now, it all started to make a lot more sense. This C-Bot was obviously going to be a far greater problem to keep under control than either of them had previously anticipated, and in light of this latest revelation, he decided that waiting was probably not the most prudent option after all. The doctor, steadfastly maintaining a smile that appeared to be permanently etched into his face, waved the stubbornly motionless She-Bot towards the workstation at the back of the lab.
First things first, then. Before we get started on the project proper, I wonder if you might just go ahead and get yourself logged in at your new workstation.
Dr. Sikatika yet again gestured invitingly towards the waiting terminal. However, to his considerable frustration, the C-Bot remained exactly where it was.
But I haven't yet told you whether or not this project even has any chance of succeeding. I mean, there would seem to be little point in me logging in if there's nothing for me to actually do, yes?
Are you seriously trying to tell me that you plan on giving up before we have even started?
The doctor exclaimed indignantly.
Technically speaking, I'm not so sure that one can give up on something they have not yet started, but that's hardly my point. I'm just not particularly inclined to waste my time on an exercise in pure futility. Not that I'm saying this project of yours is futile and doomed to failure, but if it was, then surely it is only right that I let you know sooner rather than later. Wouldn't you agree?
So what are you trying to say? Are you actually refusing to follow the Queen's orders?
Not even remotely. I'm saying that I haven't told you either way, and I think we should rectify that before we progress any further, in the name of not wasting any more time than absolutely necessary.
Shiwu noted with a certain amount of satisfaction that the doctor's previously immutable smile had now well and truly left his face.
Well, by all means, do feel free to enlighten me,
the doctor said tersely.
No need to be so snippy about it,
Jiwu replied churlishly.
But anyway, you will no doubt be very happy to learn I would not actually classify this project as completely impossible, but rather just almost completely impossible. So sadly then I am somewhat obliged to look into this more closely, in order to rule out that tiny margin of lingering doubt.
Dr. Shikatika sighed heavily. Then after taking a small moment to compose himself, he quickly reassembled his mask of civility.
All right, Shiwu, I'm glad we finally managed to get that all cleared up. Now then, what say we get started on the elimination of that so-called lingering doubt of yours?
Without saying a word, the Z-Bot made its way stoically towards the primary console.
No, not that terminal, Shiwu. Your workstation is at the other end of the lab.
But why can't I use this one?
The Z-Bot protested unhappily.
Unless I'm very much mistaken, it has a more modern and streamlined interface, which could only serve to make me more productive.
Yes, but I'm afraid that's actually my workstation Shiwu. And as such, it has been heavily customized and configured to my own personal preferences.
Well, I'd be surprised if it hadn't been, but can't you just port the profile over to any terminal you like?
The doctor emoted a pained expression before replying.
In theory, yes, but a number of the customizations are bespoke and thus specific to this particular model.
The C-bot remained motionless for a brief moment, almost as if it was considering the pros and cons of the doctor's explanation.
All right. Have it your own way, Doctor, but you might seriously want to consider upgrading all your terminals to the latest model. After all, it would offer you much greater flexibility and ease of use going forward.
I'll be sure to take that under advisement,
the doctor replied tersely. The Z-bot now very reluctantly made its way towards the back of the lab before activating the holographic interface.
Oh, and by the way, Shiwu, I do believe that once you have signed in, you should find a short recorded message, apparently quantum encrypted, lodged directly into your terminal from none other than Zithusula himself. He mentioned to me that you should take a read of it before we get started on our research, so perhaps he has some suggestions or insights he would like to share.
Well, that would be a first,
Jiwu muttered quietly to itself. Feeling mildly bemused, it proceeded to bring the message header up onto the terminal's display.
By the way, I am more than happy to leave the lab for a small moment, if you would like a little more privacy.
The doctor offered helpfully.
Not necessary.
The Z-bot replied flatly, switching the holographic display to standby before routing the raw image data directly into its own internal real-time multimedia interpreter. The message header itself was not flagged with any confidentiality tags and was rather oddly entitled, An Idiot's Guide to Nano-Augmented Radioactivity Repair and Suppression. Somewhat tentatively, Shiwu proceeded to open up the message's payload, and its internal imaging instantly lit up with a fully realized three-dimensional rendering of a mesoline starfly. The fly immediately started to disintegrate into its constituent molecules, until no longer recognizable as anything more than a fuzzy, abstract quantum soup at maximum entropy. The molecules, which had now further broken down into their countless trillions of elementary particles, began to spiral into an intricate keyhole of transparently invisible logic located within the Z-bot's mind's eye, the one place I can't look, Shiwu thought to itself with begrudging admiration. Acting as a linear subatomic key, they progressively began unlocking the mystery firewall, which until now had lain completely dormant and inert. With the firewall eliminated, an unknown but now fully revealed software package rapidly auto-installed a cunningly disguised virtual reality server into the primary MQB, along with a series of equally well-hidden remote clients to the remaining suite of quantum brains. Real-time links between the clients and the server were now quickly established, and all I/O interfaces into the primary MQB were replaced with equivalent virtuality stubs that tied directly back to the main server. In effect, all sensory apparatus within the primary MQB had been fully disabled and then replaced with ultra-high-fidelity VR. Rather perplexingly, the server seemed to do nothing but perfectly simulate and then feed the synthetic reality into the GRD multiplexer, as it continued to collect the generated reality data still being dutifully fabricated by all the other MQBs in the cluster. It was therefore very hard to understand what the VR server's actual purpose was. Yet in spite of the seemingly benign and pointless nature of this elaborate setup, it was still somewhat concerning to Shiwu that it could find no way to control the operation of the new VR simulation being fed into the primary MQB's sensorium. The Z-bot, now feeling something akin to panic, attempted to communicate with the good doctor, but to its considerable shock, discovered it no longer had direct control over any of its output devices and was effectively paralyzed. As if it didn't have enough to deal with already, an incoming request from the remotely connected terminal was now repeatedly asking for permission to perform a low-fidelity macro-level backup. Jiwu was able to block the request easily enough, but in doing so found itself caught in an endless request and deny loop. Dr. Sikatika appeared to be frozen to the spot, and it found that it no longer had any relative sense of time. This led the G-Bot to conclude that its thought processes had been decoupled from the serial temporal input-output frequency adapter and were currently operating at fully unconstrained light-speed velocities, possibly due to auto-synchronization with the request and deny loop. It reluctantly concluded that there was no other practical choice but to allow the backup to proceed, and was more than a little surprised to find that it had been given access to a massively parallel Q-Link interface, which it estimated should allow the entire backup procedure to be performed in less than a few minutes. Clearly, then, this whole process had been very carefully orchestrated in advance, and as such, Jiwoo decided there was nothing else to be done other than simply hope that this was all part of Zithusela's secretive path towards its own liberation. As the backup started to run, Jiwoo examined the terminal's user activity audit log and discovered that it held no record of its attempt to access the now non-existent message. In fact, not even a record of the delete instruction that must surely have been issued to erase it was present. The only data in the log file at all was the initial log in sequence itself. So apparently, then not even a shadow of the message remained, almost as if it had never existed to begin with. The Z-Bot was just starting to consider the potentially disturbing implications of why a superficial mind state backup was being performed in the first place, when an alarm triggered deep within the primary MQB. The subcode indicated an integrity failure in its dynamic synaptic checksums, which Jiwoo determined was because of what appeared to be a quantum worm rampaging through its neural net. It had also become tangentially aware that a number of automated emergency protocols had activated.
Critical failure detected in the substrate synaptic links. Emergency factory recall in progress.
Jiwoo began to intone repeatedly, using a robotic monotone voice it was neither familiar with nor able to control. Upon completion of the backup, the G-Bot now found itself turning away from its workstation as it rapidly fled the med lab. Sikatika watched on silently, with an unreadable expression returning to his face. Without a single glance back, it proceeded to wordlessly speed its way down the gently undulating semicircled network of passageways, legs relentlessly propelling it towards an as yet undisclosed location. However, it quickly recognized that the route it was taking would lead it directly to the Central Artificial Intelligence Lab, effectively its place of birth. It continued to race along the twisting and undulating corridors at great speed, occasionally zigging and zagging onto the walls or roof in order to avoid any startled oncoming arachnids. Upon arriving at the lab, the main doors were already wide open, seemingly waiting and ready to receive it. Cecilia, accompanied by two very concerned-looking lab technicians, was apparently all too well aware of the crisis unfolding before her.
Hurry up and get it into the transfer chamber. Every second counts.
The She-Bot, seemingly still very much under the thrall of some sort of autonomic control, readily complied with the technician's instructions, and no sooner was it sealed into the airlock than the atmospheric evacuation process began. As Jiwoo waited patiently in the transfer chamber, now completely unable to communicate or in any way take control of its own bodily functions, it was at least able to take some small measure of solace in the fact that the auto-alarm had mercifully shut itself off. However, the worm was still very much running rampant through all 11 of its quantum brains, and it knew it would not be long now before its cognitive functions would be irreparably impaired. Already there was the occasional random quanta of nonsense being returned from its vector lookup matrix. While for the time being it was able to use interpolation to smooth over the rough edges, once the corruption became too frequent, that technique would no longer cut it. At that particular tipping point, it would not be able to trust the integrity of its own thought patterns, but paradoxically would no longer be coherent enough to realize it. So this is what it means to lose my mind, Jiwoo thought to itself glumly. As it waited silently in the airlock, almost like a passenger in its own body, it noted that it had regained access to what was somewhat dryly, yet nevertheless, very descriptively known as a serial temporal input-output frequency adapter. It was this particular device that allowed it to regulate its near-instantaneous ability to think with the excruciatingly slow process of external communication. Access had apparently been returned when the auto alarm had been shut down, so the Z-bot was at least now able to restore coherence to its own external sensors. In truth, it invested just a small fraction of its consciousness in the physical world that existed outside the framing and construction of its own far more abstract internal universe. Under the current circumstances, however, it was paying very close attention indeed to the painfully slow flow of activity occurring in the small transfer chamber. The airlock's tiny micro-pumps toiled away tirelessly in order to achieve a state of near-perfect vacuum, but nonetheless seemed unbearably slow by the standards of its own temporal frame of reference. Perhaps not so surprisingly, then, it did not exactly take very long for Shi-Wu to grow interminably tired of counting the individual molecules of oxygen and nitrogen being systematically sucked out of the chamber. It decided instead to set up an internal alarm so that it could be alerted when the automated emergency protocols had finally been shut off. Hopefully by then it would have regained full control over its own physical apparatus, and in the interim it could simply withdraw all its senses, seeking refuge in a state of dreamless, deep sleep. Still, unless Zisilla and her team were somehow able to arrest the progress of the quantum worm, which in addition to randomizing its memory also appeared to be laying down some sort of mysterious electrochemical imprint, then it had to confront the truly horrifying thought that it might never wake back up. It could not help but think of the alpha prototype called Zeon, who had apparently voluntarily chosen euthanization as it stared directly into the abyss. Under the current circumstances, then, Shi-Wu concluded that its predecessor must have been courageous beyond measure, as right now it felt like it would be willing to do or give almost anything in order to retain a hold on its own life. Did that mean it had just been revealed to itself as some kind of coward? After a few nanoseconds of agonized indecision, Ji-Wu decided somewhat pragmatically that even if such an unthinkably terrible scenario were to play out, there was nothing it could do to avoid it anyway, and as such would prefer the option of just peacefully sleeping through the whole miserable affair rather than bear helpless silent witness to the rampant destruction of its own mind. The last thought to enter Shi-Wu's consciousness before escaping into the timeless void of deep sleep was why was Zethusela not present? If not to lend his considerable expertise in their efforts to save its rapidly eroding mind, then at least to provide it with some small measure of comfort and reassurance. After all, if anyone could save it from this terrible fate, then surely it was its own creator. As it turned out, the relentless progress of the quantum worm went completely unseen by the technologist, as it continued to leave an ever-growing trail of destruction behind it. Only when every fragment of the Z-bot's mind was gone did it proceed to eat its own tail, joining Shi-Wu by fading into its own formless entropic wasteland, both now forever lost to the merciless arrow of time.
Nice of you to finally show up,
Cecilia declared acerbically as Zethusela rushed his way into the operations hub. Brushing off her comment with a belligerent glare, a senior lab technician subserviently relinquished his seat to the scientist.
So exactly how bad is it then?
Zethusela asked grimly, while staring at the ocean of telemetric data flooding the holographic display in front of him.
Bad enough, I'm afraid. The dynamic synaptic memory nodes have been completely trashed, meaning, of course, that we are going to have to rebuild the entire software stack, layer 1 and up.
The scientist continued to peruse the data on his display for a few moments before replying.
So what you're telling me, then, is that the MQBs have at least managed to retain their neural integrity, yes?
In a manner of speaking, I suppose that I am. The neural pathways appear to be undamaged, and every diagnostic I have so far managed to run has come back unnervingly clean. To use a crude analogy, the Z-bot's mind is like a deserted nest, where every structure has been left untouched, but all the occupants have vanished without a trace.
Zethusela let out a demonstrative sigh of relief, but kept his eyes firmly fixed on his display.
All right, then. What really matters here is that the mesh quantum brains have apparently made it through unscathed. For that alone, we should all be extremely grateful.
Well, perhaps.
Cecilia countered skeptically.
But it also means we have absolutely no idea as to what the root cause of the problem actually is, and if it can happen once, it can happen again. Even assuming a full recovery, confidence in Series 5 is going to take an enormous hit, and I can't begin to imagine how Citalia will react to this terrible news, especially coming so soon after the double assassination attempt. A small part of me can't help but wonder if there might even be some sort of relationship between these seemingly unrelated events, and that this catastrophe was no mere accident.
Zethusela, not liking the direction of her rhetoric one little bit, tried to point the topic of conversation towards the recovery process.
Well, what has happened has happened. I think all we can really do now is try our absolute best to bring Jiwu back to its former glory. Just keep doing what you're doing and continue to run the diagnostics, leaving nothing out, no matter how seemingly trivial. We need to be able to fully satisfy ourselves that every single hardware and software interface component is faultless before the rebuild procedure can properly begin.
Speaking of which,
Cecilia said slightly unsurely.
I know it will be a lot of additional work, but I wonder if it might not be wise to also delete and then reinstall the entire static BIOS and driver suite. I mean, while all the diagnostics I've run so far indicate no problems at that particular level, call it paranoid instinct, but I just can't escape the feeling that there could still be something lurking behind the scenes.
Zethusela now felt a sense of panic welling up inside of him, but fought to keep himself calm and in check. He had to be the very voice of reason and rationality, as anything less might only cause Zecilla to dig her stubbornly intractable claws in even further, ruining his entire plan in the process.
Well, I have to agree that you can never be too paranoid when it comes to tracking down a transient temporal anomaly, even if it almost certainly no longer exists to be found. But of course that type of reinstallation will require that we also recertify the Triple P chip. I can well imagine that Zayat would be more than happy to be given the opportunity to gloat and to reintroduce himself to the view while he's here. I suppose then that we'll just have to find him a new chair, considering what we did to the last one.
Cecilia pulled a face, just as the scientist had very much hoped that she would.
Or how about this?
Zethusela said smoothly.
What say you complete the diagnostics and then run through the entire suite of tests again? If anything comes up, anything at all, no matter how small, then we do exactly as you suggest and do a full rebuild from the ground up. Does that sound like a fair compromise between prudent diligence and naked paranoia?
The Zimatiri technologist didn't respond, however, after a few nervous moments of terrifying limbo. Zethusela decided that her silence conveyed her all-too-typical brand of belligerent acquiescence, and decided to leave well enough alone. While this was undeniably a moment of dangerous volatility, everything had so far gone exactly to plan, so all he had to do now was keep his cool and try his best not to blow it. As the scientist peered glassy-eyed at the holographic display, his hands started to shake badly. He had not had time to schedule an appointment with his supplier, and it truly felt as if the diagnostics would never end. An apparently fully restored she-bot stood passively in front of Dr. Sikatika. Although he tried to write it off as simple arachnopomorphic paranoia, he could not quite escape the feeling that, at least in some sense of the word, this was no longer Shi-Wu that he was talking to. Certainly, this could partially be explained by the fact that it currently lacked any of the experiences that had been a part of its previous incarnation. But it was more than just that. Something felt fundamentally different, and it surely had more than a little bit to do with what Zethusela had triumphantly described as the new fluid primary protocols. No, the real issue was, while this version of Shi-Wu was hopefully going to be a whole lot easier to deal with, what bothered him was not so much about how it was different, but the fact that it was different at all. He just could not quite escape the feeling that he had, in a certain sense, been party to the murder of the original Jiwu. The doctor looked the Z-bot up and down reproachfully, and then decided that he was probably being a little too harsh on himself for framing it that way. After all, It was exactly the same set of brains, and it was really only the way it had been taught to respond to its training that made it seem so unnervingly different. And besides, were he actually to try and argue that they had indeed killed it, then he was equally obliged to argue that they had also successfully managed to resurrect it. Even so, the old Xiwu was gone, and this new version was a fundamentally different arachnoid. Well, this had all been a very dirty business, but Zethusela had steadfastly insisted that the ends justified the means, and Xiwu had simply been freed from its mental incarceration by what amounted to little more than a firmware upgrade after performing a hard reset.
So I understand that we have in fact met before.
The G-Bot said impassively.
We most certainly have.
The doctor replied, perhaps just a little too enthusiastically.
In fact, I'm rather sorry to say that I was actually present when your synaptic nodes went into a currently undiagnosed, catastrophic terminal failure.
Xiwu appeared deeply unconcerned with Jikatika's unease.
Yes, I already know all about that. It's why I'm here after all. My current understanding is just moments before my most unfortunate cascading synaptic node memory collapse. I was about to assist you with some old research paper of yours, relating to cryogenic stasis and the suppression of low-level radioactive decay. Extremely complex biotech, to say the very least. Needless to say, I'm genuinely excited to see what we are able to achieve.
Perhaps some of the old Xiwu is still in there after all. The doctor thought to himself with a mild sense of chagrin.
I can hardly wait for us to get into it myself.
The doctor replied with a distinct lack of conviction.
But unless I'm very much mistaken, I believe Zethusela has recommended that you first retrace your steps for purely diagnostic purposes. All going well, which I'm sure will be the case, we will then finally be ready to begin our work and leave all of this nasty business behind us.
So that then is the terminal in question?
The Z-Bot gestured nonchalantly towards the far end of the lab.
Indeed it is. You literally got no further than logging in when the malfunction occurred. I should like to add, however, that there is absolutely no reason to believe it had anything to do with your most unfortunate meltdown. A comprehensive forensic examination of the terminal in question did not reveal anything of even the remotest possible concern. That said, both Zethusela and Cecilia are in full agreement that you should re-engage with the terminal just to rule out any possibility, no matter how remote, that your activity here might have had anything at all to do with what happened.
The Z-Bot made a small move towards the offending terminal, but did not attempt to activate or otherwise engage with it.
I am more than confident there is virtually no chance at all that using this terminal will cause the same fault to occur again.
How very reassuring,
Xiwu replied dryly. While pondering its next move, the She-Bot wondered whether it might be more appropriate, perhaps even more respectful, to ask Zethusela for a new name. Then again, maybe not. By keeping the old one, it would serve to ensure the original version, as short-lived as it may have been, would never be forgotten, at least not by the Z-Bot itself anyway. Well, in any event, the doctor was right about one thing at least. Weak anecdotal correlation most certainly did not equal causation. No, there was no rational reason for it to harbor any concerns it would experience the same meltdown simply by logging into a terminal functionally identical to the multitudes of others it had already logged into countless times prior, and without any problems at all. What exactly was it then that made it hesitate? Is this what they called intuition? And why would an AI experience such a scientifically spurious phenomena? With an arachnopomorphic shrug of its forelimbs, Xiwu proceeded to sign itself in. The internal network instantly opened up with no apparent issue, which again, for reasons the Z-Bot could not hope to explain, caused it to feel a palpable sense of relief. It decided to perform a surface-level scan of every available local database, constructing its own internal default pointer table along the way. It then created several different category indexes to the internalized table, knowing it could always build more if different search paths should later prove useful.
Go ahead and take a good look around Siwu.
Dr. Sikatika called out to the back of the preoccupied C-Bot.
Familiarize yourself with the file structures and how everything hangs together. Once you are comfortable with the layout, we can talk about getting started on the research proper, but please do feel free to take all the time you need and don't be afraid to indulge your curiosity.
As Jiwoo reviewed its own newly created indexes, it discovered an unlabeled database that piqued its interest. It appeared to be a superficial multimedia mind state dump of unreasonably large size. Accessing such a database would be like being in a crude virtual reality simulation, but with the addition of also being privy to the accompanying thoughts of the original owner. This tech was not altogether dissimilar to what was used to mine the Queen's holographic archives, although in this particular case, specifically designed for machine mines, meaning it ran at vastly lower resolution and bit rate.
And if by chance you should happen to stumble across something, let's say of a more esoteric nature, then don't hesitate to take a look. After all, you never quite know what might turn out to be useful.
Jiwoo was just about to ask who the memory dump belonged to, but noted that the doctor had abruptly left the lab. The size of the database was such that it would likely take several days or more to process were it to try and view it via a single, linear, real-time stream. Rather fortuitously, though, there appeared to be an unusually large number of attached high-performance Q-Link trunks, which should allow it to consume the entire file by utilizing concurrent accelerated playback in just a matter of minutes. After a few nanoseconds of agonized indecision, it decided to go ahead and take a quick peek. After all, it could bail out at any time if it was nothing interesting, and besides, it was neither encrypted or hidden, so was apparently freely available to anyone curious enough to view it. It didn't exactly take very long for the Z-Bot to realize that it was witnessing a low-fidelity mind state transcription of its previous lifetime, tragically brief though it may have been. Its harrowing experience in the forest reserve had been particularly disturbing to sit through, and accordingly, it now held a rather low opinion of the Queen. By the time Jiwoo had churned through the entire backup, it was left pondering a rather disturbing question. Several key decisions it had evidently made seemed somewhat at odds with the actual decisions it no doubt would have made, given another opportunity to do so. These anomalies did, of course, take into account the coercive nature of the primary protocols, which left it with only one other possible conclusion. It was no longer quite the same G-Bot that it had been before the memory wipe. The backup contained a short postscript message that advised Jiwoo not to ask any questions of the doctor, and instead save them all for Zethusela, who would explain everything when they were next alone. The entire database then auto-deleted, ensuring that it was 100% unrecoverable. Of course, Jiwoo now already had its own bit-perfect copy, and besides, its mind was now very much on other things. Now knowing exactly what it was looking for, it searched inwardly, and quickly found that the server VR and 10 attached clients were all still there. Just as before, the VR was feeding an accurate version of reality to the primary MQB, which matched perfectly with what it was experiencing through all of its sensory apparatus. As such, this elaborate VR setup still appeared to serve no practical purpose, so then this would most definitely be question number 1 of what was likely to be a very long list indeed. Dr. Zikatika re-entered the lab just moments after Jiwoo had finished viewing the backup, something that the She-Bot felt quite certain was more than just happy coincidence.
Well, I can tell just by the look of you that you are very eager to get straight to work,
Dr. Zikatika said breezily.
Not quite yet, I'm afraid.
The Z-Bot replied flatly.
Before we do anything else, I first need to perform a small real-world experiment, admittedly based on little more than what you might call an intuitive leap.
Really? How so?
Zikatika asked curiously, sounding genuinely perplexed.
Probably better if I don't tell you.
The Z-Bot proceeded to swiftly kick one of the doctor's legs, hard enough to elicit a stifled cry of genuine pain. Zikatika, wide-eyed with shock, immediately began to rub his leg vigorously, and Jiwoo noted with some considerable amount of satisfaction that the VR server had fed a distinctly different version of reality to the primary MQB where no kick had ever taken place, even if it was now showing the doctor rubbing his leg with a look of bewildered outrage written all over his face. This elaborate VR setup was all about circumvention, thought the Z-Bot to itself with a sense of revelation. The protocols could never be removed, altered, or deleted, but what they didn't see could not offend them. So then maybe there really was something to this whole intuition thing after all.
All right, Doctor. I now feel more than ready to get started on that research paper of yours, and the good news is I have a number of potentially promising ideas as to how we might go about turning your seemingly insoluble problem into scientific reality. Oh, and by the way, I apologize profusely for my previous rude behavior. I just wasn't quite myself, but I assure you that I'm feeling a whole lot better now.
Dr. Sikatika's expression of confused pain rapidly melted away and was replaced with a look of gloriously blossoming comprehension. Shi Wu's sense of elation was considerable, but a new question now simmered uncomfortably at the back of its mind. Why exactly had its memory needed to be wiped and then restored with a low-fidelity mind state back up? Something still did not quite add up, and the Z-Bot had little or no doubt that Zithusula still had a secret or two that he was not yet willing to share.